Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening and how are you doing? How is your podcast coming along? I am Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You can find out every single thing about that show on my website, which I built at chrisandchristineshow.com. And don't you worry if you can't remember that. It is in the show notes of this episode. You just scroll on down. You got everything you want to know right there. But here is Podtastic Audio, and I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. I create these episodes for you, and the fact that you're here listening to this episode, I really do appreciate it so much. And I try to help you out any way I possibly can, and that's what this show is all about. So today, here on Podtastic Audio, we're going to talk about how you produce your show and how possibly I've got some tips and tricks that might be able to infuse some energy to your podcast if your show is usually lackluster for the most part. And listen, hey, for the record, your podcast is your podcast. Listen, you can do your show however you want to do it. If you are the type of person that has to just sit there and read a script word for word, or perhaps maybe you do an interview show, but it's the same thing. You're just reading questions word for word with a guest. You're going back and forth, and it's like, maybe not the most entertaining show in the world, but I'm going to tell you, I've got 8 ways on how, if your show or if you're the type of person that typically does not have high enough energy, well, I'm going to show you how possibly using these strategies that maybe you can infuse some better energy into your podcast if you typically do not usually have one. You see, with a higher energy show, people tend to listen longer and more frequently. If your show is typically at, say, an energy level of a 5, then when you gets recorded onto the microphone, onto the show, to the listener, that show level at a 5 may appear to be somewhere around a 3, which really isn't that great, if you think about it, which is very monotone, very boring. Basically, you do not want to have a boring podcast. Nobody does, because do you listen to boring podcasts? Probably not. And that goes to another point. If you have one of those shows where it's very boring, monotone, presentation style, like Bueller, like from Ferris Bueller, the teacher, if your show is like that, then it's possibly that you may not even want to listen to it, I always try to create a show that I would enjoy listening to, and I do enjoy listening to my own shows, whether this one, the Chris and Christine Show, whatever. So today I have 8 strategies on ways that you can infuse energy into your podcast, even if you're not the high energy type of person. So kicking it off with number 1, well, if you have better preparation and passion, you got to be passionate about what you're talking about. See, thoroughly doing research and prepare for each episode, knowing your material can well boost your confidence and energy level. If you're not confident about what you're talking about, it's going to sound kind of like, if you kind of want to, it's kind of like this, it's, come on, man, get a little energy. When you actually prepare to do a podcast episode, you need to choose topics that really excite you. Things that you are really passionate about, because nobody wants to do a podcast about something they could care less about. What's the point? And that's basically what I'm saying here. So moving on to number 2, vary your tone. While you may not be a naturally high energy person like myself here all the time, you can still vary your tone and add emphasis and interest to different parts of your podcast. Use inflection to convey excitement or curiosity, even if it's not that extremely exciting in the first place. I can remember when I was in acting class many, many years ago. Yeah, I was an actor. And one of the things we had to do in acting class was we had to say a phrase or say a word, like many different versions, like change the tone on the word, which actually makes it seem like you're saying something completely different. Let's just say, I love you. I love you. I love you? There's two different ways right there. You said the word, but you kind of said it differently, and it conveys a completely different response on the other side. So, moving on to number 3, speak clearly and enthusiastically. Ensure your voice is clear and easy to understand. Enunciate your words and speak with confidence. Like every single sentence, you do not want to trail the sentence off. You want to hit every sentence with like you command the sentence. You want to be able to say every word with almost like an authority, like boom, boom, boom. You're saying the words. It's not trailing off like, I don't know, maybe. You kind of, let it fall off. You don't want to do that. Even if you're not a energetic person, you can still convey enthusiasm through your tone and pacing. Okay, moving on to number 4, add dynamic elements. Now, what does this mean? This means if you're good at some kind of editing, I'm assuming you edit your podcast. Well, maybe you don't, but I'm assuming you do. You should. And what I mean editing, there's a lot of different ways you can edit. You can chop things out. You can make it sound amazing. And you also can add in music, sound effects, audio clips from different things. These kind of things within your podcast can add some energy level to your show. Now, when it comes to any of this kind of stuff, a little goes a long way. I've heard some shows that have dumped sound effects after every sentence. That's a little overboard. It's a little too much, but to each their own. If you want to create a podcast with 1,000 sound effects sprinkled throughout a 10-minute episode, go right ahead. Have fun. Call it the sound effects show or whatever you want to call it. But with your podcast, you always can change things around. You can experiment with different sound effects and different enhancements and just play around with different things. There's lots of ways to do this. If you need help, I can show you how to do it. There's lots of free sound effects out there. There's tons of sound effects out there you can get. You can make your own. You can record your own. There's tons of music you can use that's royalty-free that you can use. Play around with different things. And you can even, if you wanted to, which I had never done this yet, but I thought about it at one point, was like, just for kind of funsies, is like if you have a 2-person show, like a co-hosted show, if you can, you play around in Audacity when you do the mix down, you can put one of your hosts on the left side and the other host on the right side of the audio track, just to kind of play around with it. It's really up to you, but it does help if the podcast media host that you put your show on does release things in stereo. If they do not, speaking to you, Buzzsprout, if you host on Buzzsprout, which defaults your show down to a mono track, then those special cool effects won't even matter. But just have fun playing around with this stuff. Okay, moving on to strategy number 5 on how to make your show a little more energetic is embrace your authentic style. While it's essential to add energy, it's equally important to stay true to your authentic style. Do not try to be somebody you're not. Podcast listeners are more willing to listen to a show when they actually trust the host, when they feel like the host is being authentic, they're being real, they're not trying to fake something or other, not trying to pull one over on them. But just like anything, you got to find the right balance that works for you and your audience. So moving on to number 6, this is my absolute personal favorite of ways to make your show exciting and energetic. And that is that you should incorporate some humor into your podcast. Yeah, infuse humor into your podcast. It doesn't sound like a no-brainer. I know maybe you're not that kind of funny kind of guy. Maybe you're kind of stiff. I don't know. But if you infuse some humor in your podcast, even if it's a subtle or dry humor, it can lift the energy level and make your content more enjoyable. That's really what you got to do. Is you want to make your show very enjoyable for the audience. How do you do that? Inject some humor. You know what? Also, if you can tell some personal stories, especially funny things that happen to you, like you won't believe what happened to me today. I did this and I did that, and then this other thing happened, and kind of say it in like a funny way where obviously the end of the story wasn't a tragedy story, but it was kind of had some funny humor, some funny moments within the story. Tell those stories within your podcast. Your audience will love it. Now, moving on to number 7 on ways to make your show a little more exciting, and that is to engage with your audience. You see, if you are getting audience feedback or you're asking them questions on the podcast, encourage audience participation. You can do Q&A sessions, polls, feedback. You can do, I love to do polls on Twitter. I do the Twitter polls. It's very easy to do on Twitter. You create a poll or a session and feed it out there to your audience and maybe read back their responses on the podcast. People love hearing their own name on their podcast that they listen to. So, for example, if I said something like, hey, if you want your name read on the podcast or your show said on the podcast, please fill out this questionnaire or something, this survey. And if you need help creating a survey, they're very easy to do within Google. In the Google ecosystem, you can create a simple survey for your audience, and you can leave a link to it in the show notes of your podcast. That's one thing that goes really hand in hand. Your show notes can be used for more than just, putting down your script or whatever you talked about on your show. You can put links to different things. And one of the links I would put down there is a link to a survey that you can give your audience, and you got to give something in return. That's the thing too. When you want actual listener feedback, like something that they're going to do for you, you got to do something for them. And I know some will say, well, I just created the show. The show is for them. I made the show, so they owe me. And it doesn't always work that way, So what you got to do is give a little enticing something for your audience to actually participate. Now, wouldn't that be nice? And moving on to the number 8, the very final tip I have on how to make sure your show is a little more exciting, and that is to practice. They always say practice. If you're an amazing musician, you didn't get there overnight. You always had some practice before you got there. So with a little practice and a little feedback from your friends and family, you say, hey, how was this episode? How did I create it? How was my energy? Was it good? Was it not good? Practicing your delivery to become more comfortable and confident. Practice can help you find your right rhythm and pacing for your podcast because, some people aren't naturally gifted at doing this kind of stuff. And also, you want to make sure that you seek some feedback from maybe your friends, your family, somebody that you trust would give you an honest feedback about your delivery method and how don't so much on the content. We're talking more about the actual delivery method of the content. They may say, oh, your topic is very interesting, and I find that very intriguing. You talked about X, Y, and Z, and that was very neat. That was a neat podcast. You say, no, I want to know, how was this show delivered? Was it exciting? Did it bring out some energy? Were you excited to listen to it? Remember, it's okay to be yourself. It's your thing. It's your podcast. You can do it however you want to do it. So those are 8 strategies that you could use today or on your very next recording of your podcast to infuse some kind of energy into your show. The audience loves listening to a show that excites them. If it excites you as the podcast host, then the audience is going to get excited because you're excited. It's kind of like a give and take. Think of all the different things you listen to. Maybe it's podcasting, maybe it's movies or television or YouTube videos, whatever it is. If the host is extremely boring, whatever the content, usually people don't stick around for too long. So making an exciting show for your audience will keep them engaged and wanting to come back and possibly share the show, which would be amazing. I've always tried to make the Chris and Christine show as exciting as we possibly can. And I think we do feed off each other's energy, especially since we're sitting right here in the same room together. And it's probably more difficult to have some kind of energy level or higher energy level if you're not facing the other person in the same room. Maybe you can through video conferencing. Maybe. Sometimes. Or possibly when you're doing a solo show like I'm doing right now. Sometimes it's hard to really, bring out some kind of energy level. It's just hard to pull that off. You're just talking to nobody. Like I'm talking to the computer. I'm facing the computer and I'm talking right to the computer screen. That's all I'm doing. But I really am talking to you, and I'm talking through the computer screen to you. And I'm trying to bring out the best energy level I possibly can, but not too much, not too little, just right. And to recap, the 8 strategies on how to make sure your show has more exciting energy is through preparation and passion, vary your tone, speak clearly and enthusiastically, add dynamic elements, embrace your authentic style, incorporate some humor, engage with your audience, and finally, practice makes perfect. So keep on practicing these strategies, and hopefully your podcast will be more exciting and more entertaining. I can't wait to listen. Hey, thank you once again for listening. And if you found any value from listening to this podcast today, maybe you learned something new or something that can benefit your podcast, please share this episode with a friend. Every single podcast player has an app that has a sharing feature built right into it. Just click the little tab and share it with all of your friends that possibly could need to use this information to create a better podcast for them. And I will see you on the next episode.